Hi all, I'm just going to do a short presentation to go along with the PowerPoint that I posted to kind of explain some of the ideas in there in a little bit more context. So part of what I'm really trying to do with this PowerPoint is to talk about the differences between contemporary legends, which we talked about last week, and local legends. There are a lot of similarities between them, right? Sometimes local legends are, as it says here, just simply localized versions of contemporary legends. So you'll find variants of the boyfriend's death, or the hook man, or the vanishing hitchhiker, or other things like that that are connected to a specific local place, right? So you might hear this happened sometime in the 1950s at that, you know, parking spot that's on the outskirts of town, right? And then you might hear the hook story following that, right? And that's what really makes local legends local, right? That the story is usually connected to a very specific local site. And often these are sort of unique natural sites, right? Local sites, either some kind of local landmark, some sort of unusual landscape feature, an abandoned house or building, a local cemetery or bridge, right? The story is often more about the place than it is about anything else, right? That if that place didn't exist, you wouldn't have the story. If you don't have the landmark, then you don't have the story. And that becomes really important in other ways that we'll talk about shortly. Okay. Sometimes local legends are, in fact, actually connected to real historical and events and people, right? But again, it's a legend, right? So the story picks up where the actual facts leave off. The legend is fiction, but it may have a basis in fact or local history. Again, as an example, when I lived in Colorado, the town that I lived in had a building downtown, an old building that used to be the armory. It hadn't been the armory for years and years. In fact, it had turned into a bar, and a bar that, was really popular with students. And students who went there and students who worked there would often say that the basement of the armory was haunted, right? And that if you were there after the bar closed, you could often hear the sound of children in the basement. Might be children laughing, might be children screaming, depending on the version, but it was always children in the basement. And there was really no explanation about why this was. And I didn't really know about it until pretty shortly before I moved. And there was a big story in the local newspaper about it being the 50th anniversary of a terrible school bus crash that had happened, where a school bus full of kids had been crossing the railroad on its way back from school one day, did not hear the train coming. Bus was hit by the train, and virtually all the children on the bus were killed. And in fact, so many of them were killed that there wasn't room in the local morgue for all of them. And so they used the basement of the armory, right, which was then owned by the military, to keep the children's bodies until their families could come and identify them and take them away. I had never heard this story. And in fact, apparently, according to the newspaper article, this was such a traumatic event in the community that people who had been affected by it pretty much never talked about it because it was just so upsetting to them. But with the 50th anniversary coming up, people had felt the need to start talking about what had happened again. But it was the perfect explanation for why the basement of the armory was said to be haunted by children, because in fact, after this terrible school bus crash, the basement of the armory had been used as a makeshift morgue for those children. So I think that's like the perfect example of the ways in which local legends often do have a basis in local history. But again, whether you believe the basement of the armory is haunted or not is a different story, right? That's the legend. The story itself about the bus crash is the fact, right? But often there's a really blurry line between those two. And that's really unique to local legends. So the reason why I put Ruth Ann Music's whole book, The Telltale Lilac Bush, up on eCampus for you to look at is because I think a lot of those are perfect illustrations of, first of all, the ways in which local legends are often kind of local versions of well-known contemporary legends, and also how they're linked to specific places and landmarks and even people at specific points in time, right? So here are some of the ones that I think kind of illustrate all of those points. Right? So whereas contemporary legends get modified every time they're retold to fit whatever the context is where they're being told, right? Oh, this really happened last week in Morgantown to my friend's sister, right? Local legends often are much more rooted in a very specific time and place, right? They don't travel in the same way contemporary legends do, right? So whereas contemporary legends are often said to have happened recently, local legends often have a very specific date attached to them: the Civil War, the Depression, or right, it's just the distant past, right? Another major difference, right, has to do with what's called belief attitude. And belief attitude means what the people who tell and hear legends think about whether they're true or not, right? When people tell contemporary legends and pass them along, as we talked about last week, it's because they tend to believe that the stories could be true. They may not believe that that story itself is literally true, but there's something truthful about the story. And there's something intriguing enough about it that they want to pass the story along so that they can talk to other people about whether they think the story is possibly true. Local legends are really different in terms of belief attitude. In general, people who know the stories tend to put pretty little stock in them as legends, certainly less generally than people put into contemporary legends, right? Also, another major difference in terms of belief attitude and local legends is that people's belief attitude is going to vary widely depending on where they are when they're telling or hearing the story and what they're doing when they tell and hear the story, right? And we'll talk about that again in another minute. Right. Another thing that is related to local legends, right, is what's called partial or conditional belief, right? And this is the notion that people's belief attitude, as I said before, depends so much on the context in which they hear a story, right? That under certain circumstances or conditions, somebody's level of belief in a local legend might be very high, but under other conditions, it might be very low, right? And this is not unique to local legends, right? We have the same kind of conditional belief in other kinds of folklore as well, especially things like superstitions and divination rituals, right? When we talked about superstitions earlier in the semester, some people were a little sheepish about admitting to practicing certain superstitions, right? You're a little embarrassed to say, yeah, well, I always do X you know, before a basketball game or before a meet or before I go on stage. Because outside of the context of that particular event, it seems a little silly to say that this is something you do. But in the context of preparing for a sporting event or some other kind of high stakes occasion like an audition or a performance, the belief in those superstitions is pretty high, right? So much so that, as we talked about, people generally won't not do them because of their fear of what will happen if they don't perform those superstitions. And yet, when you're not in that high stakes situation, you are a little bit more embarrassed to admit that you have this kind of belief, right? That's a really good example of conditional belief as well, right? Similarly with those sort of divination rituals, right? If you're playing MASH and your results say that, you know, all of the worst possible options are going to come true, right? You're probably going to say, oh, well, we did something wrong. We'll have to try it again. Or you're going to, you know, just laugh it off as a joke, right? Whereas if it turns out that everything is perfect, right, you're going to think, yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen, right? Your belief level is going to be higher. Another important factor about local legends is that they tend to exist in multiple variants, right? That again, if it's the particular place that's really important to the very existence of the legend, right? That the legend is attached to a specific abandoned building or bridge or natural feature or landmark, right? Um, that's what really matters, right? And the story about what happened there isn't quite as important, right? So you'll often have a lot of different versions of what allegedly happened at this haunted house, or why, you know, this building was abandoned. All right, you'll have a lot of different stories, and you'll see this in that video about the Walhalla Ravine legends, that there are, you know, innumerable different stories about what happened there, right? That's because it's the place that matters, not the story itself, right? Also, right, it's because with local legends, the narrative aspects of the story, right, the text isn't as important as the context, right? Because often local legends have specific customs associated with them, right? And specifically, right, this is what's called legend tripping, right? So this is the custom of going to the site of a local legend in order to test its validity, right? So it's not enough just to tell the story about what happened at that abandoned building or why that house is haunted, right? The whole point of telling the story often is to kind of get geared up to go there and see what happens, right? Because often there is something specifically that you're supposed to do when you get there, right? That will prove whether the story is true or not, right? So for instance, there, you know, virtually every place has a local legend about a bridge or a you know, kind of rural road or someplace like that where you're supposed to go and stop your car and flash your headlights, and you know, the car is supposed to roll forward on its own, right? Or you're supposed to see lights flashing back at you or something like that. You know, that's the real central part of the legend, right? It's not the story about why that's happening. It's going there and seeing if it happens, right? The custom outweighs the story itself. You might recall that video about the Walhalla Ravine in Columbus, Ohio that you watched earlier this semester. That's a really good example of a local legend. So if you want to watch it again, you're welcome to, just to remind yourself. But I think in there we see all the hallmarks of a local legend. Every person interviewed in that video had a slightly different version of the story, and sometimes they were very different versions of the story. They had varying levels of belief in the stories, right? There was legend tripping connected with it. You might recall the one guy who went there with his friends after a football game, and they actually went up to the door of the house. That's the kind of testing thing that goes on with legend tripping. And a lot of people used conditional belief statements, right? I don't know if it's true, but you know, I'm not gonna do anything to find out, right? It's a really good illustration of how local legends work. So if you want to look at it again, that's fine. But we will certainly talk more about this next Tuesday when we talk about local legends in West Virginia, including Mothman and the Flatwoods Monster. So I will see you then. Have a good weekend.